So I'm here to talk about our research on the policy framework for WSUD in 5 Australian cities we've just recently conducted. But before launching into the main focus of the presentation, I'll just give you a bit of a background on the project for those not familiar with the CRC. So CRC for Water-Sensitive Cities is a major interdisciplinary and multi-institutional collaborative research initiative aimed at revolutionising urban water management within Australia and overseas. There are 4 research streams, and this project, which is called Statutory Planning for WSUD, is part of Program B, Water Sensitive Urbanism, focusing on the influence of urban planning on resource flows across a range of scales. This project, which is conducted in conjunction with Maddocks lawyers, is purpose, as the name suggests, is to assess the role that statutory planning regulation and processes play in facilitating or constraining the adoption of WSUD. And it ultimately hopes to identify best practice planning policies and legislative framework for mainstreaming WSUD in Australian cities. I should note that this project doesn't assess risk and governance arrangements. They are related issues, particularly relevant to the reuse of stormwater or recycled water. We do touch on that in our review, but they're actually examined by other CRC projects. The review also is a desktop review and doesn't consider any reform agenda. Otherwise, we would never be finishing the review, given that there's constantly a talk of reform or revision to policy framework. So Project B 5.1's literature review, which is our first major research output, and focus of this presentation, examines the statutory planning policy framework affecting Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide and Perth, and looks at the framework through very much a legal lens. That means looking at its clarity, efficiency, coherency of policies and control at different scales. That's obviously not to say that it's going to be the legalistic reports, but it's sort of designed to be read by a diverse range of audience. The publication of the report is pending. It has 5 separate reports. There's about sort of 500 odd pages of when you put the reports together. So what I'm going to be giving you in this presentation is really just a snapshot of what's in the report. The review will ultimately inform the final report to be released sometime next year, which will provide a comparative analysis of policy regimes across the 5 jurisdictions and identify policy reform priorities for WSUD in Australia. So in terms of the research parameter of the literature review and what we mean by policy framework for WSUD, given that the project is focused on the urban development sector and town planning systems, we look at aspects that are related to them, and as well as, I suppose, aspects that tend to sit sort of on the perimeter or periphery of the planning framework, such as natural resource management policies and flood management policies, which we've noticed that it's fairly strong in South Australia. And the review looks at how these aspects impact the implementation of WSUD at various scales, as you can see on the screen there. For this particular presentation, I'll just focus on 5 key aspects. That's the state planning policy, environmental protection policy on water quality, WSUD at different scales, including an example of local policy from Victoria, and WSUD infrastructure funding and implementation guidelines. So on to our first observation in regards to state planning policy for WSUD. So, and how the approach is taken for mainstreaming it in each jurisdiction. Generally, we found that with exception to New South Wales, WSUD is a well-established concept in all states and supported under respective state planning policies. In most states, WSUD is seen as an important way to manage urban stormwater and also an interchangeable concept to integrated water cycle management. But we've also found that there's no consistent statutory definition for it. In terms of approaches taken to implementing policy and mainstreaming it, without sounding like I'm championing my own state, Victoria has the most clearly defined WSUD policy with respect to its scope and legislative basis for the application. The policies listed in the table, I don't know whether you can see that, it's State Environmental Protection Policy, Waters of Victoria, Best Practice Environmental Management Guidelines, State Planning Policy Framework, and Victorian Planning Provision Clause 56.07. Automatically form part of all planning schemes in Victoria and apply to residential subdivisions. And they're underpinned by clearly legislated policy on stormwater runoff objectives that are integrated into the planning system. And I'll discuss this a bit further in the next slide. For other jurisdictions, however, WSUD policy operates within a much more discretionary framework, and there is also quite a wide spectrum to what this means and the breadth of discretion given to authorities. So in this spectrum for Queensland, which is, I suppose we would suggest at the narrower end of the discretionary spectrum, the state planning policy and the South East Queensland regional plan contain quite detailed policy measures for managing urban stormwater. So Queensland's approach to mainstreaming WSUD is to embed WSUD policy in all planning schemes by requiring them to be consistent with the state planning policy and the regional plan under the Sustainable Planning Act. And from legalistic point of view, those wording, I suppose, is much less ambiguous than other provisions. In Western Australia, which sort of, I suppose, sits in the middle of that spectrum, where the term WSUD was originally coined, best urban water management and livable neighbourhoods are the key WSUD policy and concerned with structure planning and subdivision of urban areas. Western Australia has similar approach to Queensland, but the requirements and the wording of the provisions under their Planning Act is less clear, and therefore we feel gives planning authorities wider discretion to apply and adopt the provisions of the state planning framework into the regional local planning schemes in comparison to, for example, Queensland. South Australia, which we view as sitting at the other end of the spectrum, is where WSUD is supported under a number of policies, as just discussed by previous speakers. But there really seems to be no legal obligation for Council to adopt any of these provisions, and therefore allows for widest discretion. It's clear that water-sensitive cities in South Australia, which are the policy document that Julie mentioned, is the primary WSUD policy document in this state. It's unclear as to, from our perspective, where it's set within the planning framework and what impact it has on planning decisions at local level, as it doesn't seem to sit within the planning strategy or anywhere else for that matter. So the take-home message from this aspect is, whereas Victoria's policies have automatic effect in the planning system, albeit for just for residential subdivision, all other jurisdictions rely on local councils to adopt WSUD policy into their planning scheme to give them effect, and allows council to tailor them to suit individual needs. So next observation in regards to stormwater quality runoff and flow targets. In Victoria, the water quality targets are adopted under the SEP Waters of Victoria and the BPEM guidelines, which are established under the State's Environmental Protection Act. And they must be given effect in planning decisions under the Planning and Development Act. They're also incorporated into the Victorian planning provisions, which form the basis of all local planning schemes and underpin the operation of Clause 56.07. In other jurisdictions, similar to the previous slide, water quality targets are generally adopted under non-statutory guidelines and identified as important matters in planning policy that are applied within a discretionary framework. So what does this mean for the implementation of WSUD at different scales? This remote's really playing up. So precinct structure planning and residential subdivision. Victoria is the only state, as you can see on the table there, with any kind of binding requirement for integrated water cycle management and WSUD. WA has a well-defined policy for this scale of development under the livable neighbourhoods and better urban water management, but the application of policy, as foreshadowed earlier, is discretionary. In other states, there aren't specific policy developed for this scale, so the overarching state planning policies potentially provide a broad basis for councils to adopt WSUD requirements into their planning schemes. For urban infill development, as you can see there, really pretty much all jurisdictions have a policy gap in that particular area, and I suppose it's a hot topic within the WSUD space because it is a big challenge for everyone to tackle that particular scale of development. For lot scale, firstly, whether a lot development is subject to WSUD objectives depend on the council's ability to impose planning controls. So in most states, lot scale development is not subject to planning controls unless they're in a particular zone overlay and lot size. WA doesn't have any WSUD related building and plumbing regulations, but probably the only state that has the R codes, which provides statutory planning controls for residential developments through the state. Under it, all dwellings in areas to demonstrate compliance and with the stormwater management deemed to comply provisions, which essentially means all water runoff from the lot site is to be retained on site where climatic and soil conditions allow for the effective retention. In other jurisdictions, lot-scale developments are subject to various sustainability targets or measures under respective states' building and plumbing regulations, but variable controls with respect to stormwater management under planning. Obviously, South Australia actually has the Section 78AA, which is fairly similar to the R code, but on close inspection, it seemed that the application of that might be fairly narrow as well. Having said that, so despite the policy gap, we found that a review of local council policies suggests that many councils in all jurisdictions pretty much have been very active in developing and implementing local WSUD policy. So I thought I'd show you an example of a Victorian planning scheme, the Port Phillip planning scheme, which extended the objectives of the clause 56.07 and the BPM guidelines to other classes of development. So this particular local planning policy applies to new buildings, extension to existing buildings, which are 50 square metres in floor area or over, a subdivision in a commercial zone. So pretty much the categories that fall outside the clause 56.07. And this particular clause is pretty much adopted in its form or pretty much identical. Policy has been adopted by at least 3 other metropolitan councils in Victoria, and various other councils have adopted a similar version under the banner of Environmental Sustainable Development Policy or other names. So the main feature of this policy, might be a bit hard for you to read there, is under the objectives, it references the BPM guidelines and reiterates the pollutant load reduction targets, which are in the guidelines. And it's to promote the use of water-sensitive urban design, mitigate the detrimental effect of development on downstream waterways, minimise peak stormwater flows and stormwater pollutants, so it addresses flow target issues as well, and reintegrate urban water into the landscape to facilitate a range of benefits. And that's really touching on the microclimate cooling, local habitat, biodiversity issues as well. So, and it also, under the clause, there's an application requirement for all development applications to include water-sensitive urban design response, which includes site layout plan showing the location of proposed stormwater treatment measures, a report showing how the application achieves the objectives of this policy and using music or storm to assess it. Design details such as cross-sections to show the technical effectiveness of the proposed stormwater treatment measures. Site management plan, maintenance program, which sets out measures, operational and maintenance arrangements. It also provides that if an application can't, for some reason, meet the targets or objectives of the BPM guidelines, it must show, include justification for how the development meets the objectives in other ways. Sorry, yep. So next observation, second last observation, is to funding WSUD in the public realm. So this is a complex issue which really can't be fully canvassed in this forum, but really the takeaway point is that of all jurisdictions, perhaps with the exception of South Australia, provide local councils with the power to levy development contributions under their Planning Act. But there's a high degree of variability in the approaches taken and amount levied both within and across the jurisdictions. I mean, we say South Australia is an exception because although it has the Planning and Development Fund and various other funds set up under its Planning Act to be, but it doesn't seem to allow it to be used directly to fund WSUD infrastructure. At present, you can see there, Queensland and New South Wales are the only jurisdictions where the amount is capped, and any proposed charges above the capping overseen by an independent price regulator, and Victoria government is considering a move to this system as well. We suggest that variability in this realm is potentially a limiting factor to achieving consistent implementation of WSUD in the public realm, which really ultimately requires strategic planning. And infrastructure planning by water agencies and local government are also often not aligned to facilitate the provision of WSUD in the public realm in pretty much all jurisdictions. And as you can see in the last column there, market mechanisms such as water quality offset programs are not widely used at present. And Victoria is really the only state with a water quality offset program at a state level, which is operated by Melbourne Water. And our last observation is in regards to implementation guides. So all jurisdictions offer a range of guides, but with much more limited range being available in New South Wales and South Australia. So our observation here is that the guides are often non-statutory and poorly integrated into the policy framework and generally dispersed, and therefore making it difficult to locate. So just in summary, most jurisdictions have developed state policies to support the implementation of WSUD, but the approaches, as you've seen, vary widely. The concept of WSUD is well established in most jurisdictions, but there's no consistent statutory definition. In Victoria, the SEP Waters of Victoria and the BPM guideline is the key driver for the implementation of best practice stormwater management, and it must be given effect in planning decisions, whereas the legal status of water quality policy is less clear in other states. WSUD policy and planning controls are generally better developed in precinct structure planning and residential subdivisions, with policy gaps in infill and lot development in all jurisdictions. WSUD is often developed in the public realm where there is a clear PSP process in place, but tends to be delivered on site in established areas. And market mechanisms such as offsets are not widely used at present. A range of guides, implementation guides, are offered in most jurisdictions, but these are often non-statutory, poorly integrated and dispersed. And many councils have been at the forefront of policy development, which reflects the fact that, and goes back to the first point of the summary, that most jurisdictions allow councils to tailor WSUD policies to local circumstances, rather than imposing statewide controls or obligation and having automatic effect in planning schemes. So just in closing, I just wanted to mention that that a number of questions arise from our review, which we'll be seeking input and responses from our CRC stakeholders and relevant interest bodies. I don't obviously have time to go through these questions at this forum, but just wanted to flag that these questions will be contained in our issues paper, which will be published shortly, and the responses will really help to shape our final report. So I'm hoping that all of you can take some time to respond to the questions when they are released, because your input will actually ensure that policy reform priorities that we identify in our final report do address concerns that are particular to your organisation. Thank you.